Greetings and welcome back to the channel. So in this episode I'm actually going to install MX Linux onto an external hard drive, and that way I won't actually affect my main computer. So it's a good way to try out MX Linux, and one of the other benefits is that I'll actually be able to move the operating system around and plug it into different computers and still work in MX Linux. So let's get into the video. Cool, so for this exercise I actually found this old hard drive. I rescued it out of an old computer which was completely broken, but the hard drive seems to be okay. It's a 160 gigabyte SATA drive, so it's not the most modern in terms of hard drives in the world, and it's only running at 5400 RPM, so it's not exactly the fastest hard drive in the world either. But that said, because I'm installing MX Linux is a very fast operating system, so even though this is not the fastest hard drive in the world, it'll still run pretty fast. Actually, it would run faster than if this was running Windows. So I'll firstly remove the other hard drive from the caddy and put that in a safe place, and then pop this recycled hard drive in and pop the cover back on, lock it. Cool, so now it's time to plug in the hard drive to my computer. And let's get into it. So pretty much the first thing to do is, of course, download MX Linux. So I'll jump online and do that right now. So just do a search for MX Linux. And here's the official website, mxlinux.org. And I'll just jump straight to the download page. And I'll scroll down a little bit, and these are the options that I have. So XFCE is a desktop environment. It's very slim and it doesn't use much RAM, so that's actually going to be the version that I'll download. And we have various options. We have the 64-bit version, we have the 32-bit version, and we have the advanced hardware support version for anyone who's running newer hardware. Now my computer's pretty ancient, so it doesn't actually have any advanced hardware. Now if you wanted the KDE version, that is of course available, as well as the Fluxbox versions. And Fluxbox is a Windows manager which is really light on your system resources. So if you're really limited with your RAM in your computer, or you plan on using the hard drive with a computer that does have limited RAM, then Fluxbox is definitely a cool option. So I'm going to download the 64-bit version, so I'll just scroll down a bit. Here are the options that I have to download. So I can either download it directly from the MX Linux repository, or I can use a mirror, or there is of course the torrents. Now if you look here, there's also the official monthly snapshot. Now this is an updated version of the original release, and I normally would actually download the snapshot. I'll actually check it and see if there's any that have been created. No, they haven't been created yet, so I'll just go back a page. Cool, so I'm actually going to download the torrent, so I'll click that. And here's the XFCE 64-bit version, so I'll download that as well. And I'll just save that to my downloads folder. And so this is the torrent file, it's not actually the ISO image, so I'll need a torrent client to be able to download torrents. So I'll open a new tab and then do a search for qBittorrent. And then I'll click on the official website and then jump over to the download page, and here is the link to the Windows installer. So I'll just click that and then download the 64-bit version for my computer. Now this is the 32-bit version if you have an older computer, but my computer is a 64-bit computer, so I'll click that and then save to my downloads folder. Cool, that's done. So now I'll double click the installer and then just run through the installation process. So next, agree, next, install. Now the benefit of downloading using a torrent is that you can actually stop and start the download. So this can be really handy if your internet connection is not the greatest in the world. Cool, so that's installed. So I'll click finish, which will launch qBittorrent. And now I'll double click the torrent file that I downloaded and that will load it into qBittorrent. So this is going to download it into my downloads folder. So I'll click OK, and that has begun. So I'll just move this to the right and then jump back into my web browser. And so what I'm going to do now is actually download and install a couple of programs that will allow me to install the ISO image or the installer onto a USB drive. Now really you only need one of these downloads, but I'm going to demonstrate using both of these programs. Now the first program I'm going to download is one called Rufus. So I'll just do a search for that. And here is the official website, rufus.ie. And if I just scroll down the page a bit, here is the latest version. So Rufus 3.17, I'll download that and save that to my downloads folder. Cool, now the other tool that I'll demonstrate, and this is the tool that I normally use, is one called Ventoy. So here's the official website, ventoy.net. So I'll just jump into that website. And then over to the downloads page. And here is the Windows version. So there's a Windows version and a Linux version. And Rufus, there is only the Windows version. So if I scroll down a bit, here is the windows.zip file that I'll download. So I'll download that and save that to my downloads folder as well. Cool, so I can close that tab. Now the big difference between Rufus and Ventoy is that with Rufus you can only actually install one ISO image on a USB drive at a time, whereas with Ventoy you can actually put multiple ISO images. So if you like to distro hop and try out different Linux distributions or operating systems, then Ventoy is absolutely brilliant. Now the cool thing about Rufus, and the reason why many people have great success using Rufus, is that Rufus actually auto detects your file system, especially if you're using Rufus on the same computer that you are doing the install on. Ventoy is very similar too, and you also have the option to change the file system if you need to. So I can close both of those tabs now and then jump into my downloads folder. Cool, so I'll just minimize my web browser. And so here are my two downloads, the Ventoy zip file and rufus.exe. So I'll firstly extract Ventoy. Now the thing about both the Rufus executable and also the Ventoy executable is that these are both the programs themselves. They're not actually the installer. There's actually no need to install it per se. So you kind of have to manually install these yourself. So I'll do that now. I'll open a new file browser window and I'll just move this to the right a bit and then open up my C drive and navigate my way to my program files directory. So there it is there. And then firstly, I'll jump back into my downloads folder and I'll just drag this entire extracted Ventoy folder into my program files directory. And then while I'm in program files, I'll create a new folder. So Control-Shift-N to create a new folder. And of course, I'll name this Rufus. And then I'll drag the Rufus executable into the Rufus folder. There we go. So now what I want to do is actually create a couple of launches in my start menu. So firstly, I'll enter the Rufus directory and then right click the executable file and then select pin to start and then go back to the program files directory and do the same for Ventoy. Ventoy to disk.exe is the program, so I'll pin that to start as well. And now I can close out of those folders and jump into my start menu. And here are the new launches that I just created. So I'll move these both over here and then launch Rufus. Cool, so I'll move this to the left now, and as you can see, The MX Linux download has completed, so I can now remove that from qBittorrent and then quit out of qBittorrent. Cool, and now I'll take my USB drive and put that into my computer. And that's been recognized by Rufus now, so I'll go over to this select button and then I'll choose the ISO image, and actually I'll copy the name while I'm here. So that's now loaded the ISO image into Rufus, and the partition scheme and target system have both been auto-detected by Rufus, so I'll leave those as is, and I'll leave all the other presets the same except for the volume label, which I'll paste the name that I copied. There we go. And that way I know which version of Rufus I have on this drive. Now this device name, currently it says Ventoy because I have installed Ventoy onto this USB stick, so this name will actually be replaced by this new volume label, and I'll leave everything else as is and then just click start and then OK to write in ISO image mode. And here's the warning that it's going to delete all the data and the partitions from the drive. So that's now installing the ISO image launcher onto the USB drive. So I'll speed up this little bit of the video and I'll return once the installation has completed. Cool, that's completed. So as you can see, the device name has changed to the name that I named it. So this USB drive is now currently ready to go. So I can now easily install MX Linux using this USB drive. Now what I'm going to do is show you how to use Ventoy. Now this means that I can put multiple ISO images onto the same USB drive. So I'll throw that back into the computer and I'll close out of Rufus, and this time I'll launch Ventoy to disk. And I'll just move this over to the left a bit. Now at the moment the Ventoy package is running as master boot record, or MBR. Now if you wanted to change that, just open option and you can change the partition style from MBR to GPT if you need to. But I'm going to leave it on MBR, and currently, as you can see, it's blank here. Ventoy has not been installed onto this USB drive just as yet. So if I click on install, this will format the USB drive and replace it with Ventoy. Congratulations! Now we have Ventoy running on the USB drive. So I can close out of Ventoy to disk, and you pretty much don't have to use Ventoy again unless you wanted to actually update the version of Ventoy you have running on your USB drive. So I'll close out of Ventoy to disk and open up a file browser window, and I'll just move this to the left a bit. And so here is my USB drive. So if I enter that, you can see currently it's empty. Now because I actually have Ventoy on my USB drive, all I have to do is open a new file browser window, and I'll enter the Ventoy program there, and then go back to this one, go to my downloads folder, and all I have to do is copy the ISO image onto the Ventoy drive. So it's actually that simple. Now if I go to installers, and I'll also copy across Fedora XFCE, and I'll copy that over. And now I can close this file browser window and enter the Ventoy drive. And if I move this over to the left again, and so all I have to do now is just wait for these programs to copy to the USB drive, which is really simple. So I'll fast forward this little bit of the video and then rejoin you once the copies have completed. Cool, so the copying has finished and I now have 2 ISO images on my one USB drive. So essentially if I reboot the computer, I can actually install either Fedora or MX Linux 21. So I can close out of my file browser window, and I'll also close my web browser. And what I want to do now is actually reboot into my UEFI settings, or otherwise known as the BIOS settings. And the reason why I'm doing that is so that when I boot up my computer, it will actually boot into the USB drive rather than into Windows like it would normally. So to do that, open your Start menu and you want to go into your PC settings, or if you don't actually have your PC settings in your Start menu, just do a search for PC settings. There it is there, but I'm going to launch it from my Start menu. And then go to Update and Recovery, and then Restart Now from there. Now there's actually a quicker way of doing it, which I'll show you right now, and that is to right click your Start menu, and then hover over Shutdown or Sign Out, and then press and hold your Shift key on your keyboard, and then simply select Restart. So this should essentially restart you into your advanced startup options, which will allow you to enter into your BIOS. Now, if you are actually using an older Windows version, then this restart technique may not work. So the best bet would be to jump online, find the model of computer that you have, and then find out how you can actually enter your BIOS on your computer. So oftentimes when you boot up your computer, somewhere on the screen it'll actually tell you which key to press to enter your BIOS. But if all else fails and you can't find the information you're after, then quite often the technique that you'd normally use would be to power up your machine, and then as soon as it powers up, start tapping your F2 key, and that should actually get you into your BIOS. And if that fails, then shut down your computer again, power your computer up again, and then start tapping your F8 key. And if that doesn't work, then try the same with your F5 key. And if none of those work, then it may be another key that you need to press, but it's pretty easy to find out online which key it is. So I'm going to do this method of right clicking my Start menu, hold down my Shift key, and then click Restart. Cool, so we should now be rebooting into the advanced startup options. There we go. So now I'll click on Troubleshoot, and then Advanced Options, and then UEFI Firmware Settings. So this is essentially going to reboot into the BIOS or the UEFI settings. And there we go. So the first thing to do is to turn off Secure Boot. So in my BIOS it's called Secure Boot Control. So I'll just disable that. And the reason why I'm doing that is so that we can actually boot into the USB drive. Cool, now I'll go over to boot options, and as you can see in the boot option priorities, currently Windows Boot Manager is at the #1 position, which basically means that if I reboot the computer as is, then it will actually automatically boot into Windows. So I actually want to change this, so I'll press enter and then select my USB drive. And now when I reboot the computer, it will actually reboot into the USB drive rather than Windows. So I'll go over to save and exit, and then press enter, and then yes to save the configuration, and this will reboot the computer into the USB drive. And here we go, we've now booted into the USB drive. And so as you can see, I have two ISO images that I can load from here. So I can either install Fedora if I wanted to, or MX Linux. So I'll select MX21 and then press enter. And this is our first screen. So I'll just go straight up to MX21 and then click enter. And so here we are now booting into the USB drive. So MX21 is codenamed Wildflower. And here are our wildflowers. Cool, so here we are in MX Linux. So currently this is the live version of MX Linux and it's running off the USB drive. So what we're about to do is actually install MX Linux onto the external hard drive. So this is the welcome screen, and there are plenty of things to explore here, from frequently asked questions, and there's the manual. We've got the wiki. We can actually start customizing it by using these two tools here. We have access to the forums. There are videos we can watch. If you'd like to contribute to the project, then I'm sure the MX Linux team would welcome that. There are popular apps that we can download and install from here, and there is this brilliant tour. So I'll open that up. And if you're new to Linux, or MX Linux, then this tour is very comprehensive and succinct as well, and it's a great way to learn about MX Linux and all the various things you can do with it. So I'll let you explore that yourself. It's a really brilliant tool. It's definitely well worth checking out. So I'll close out of there and jump over to the About tab, and here we can see we are running MX21. So 21 actually refers to the year. So the previous version of MX Linux was MX19, and that was released in, of course, 2019. There wasn't actually a version released in 2020 because the 2019 version had a lot of updates that were being applied to it over 2020, and as a result has been a very stable operating system to use. So the desktop environment is XFCE, and MX Linux is based on Debian version 11.1. So this is the long-term support version, which is very, very stable. Now, MX21 is actually supported all the way to June 2024. So there is plenty of life left in this operating system. And even if there is a new version that comes out next year or the year after or anything like that, then you don't actually have to upgrade to that, because this version, MX21, still has support to 2024. So what this means is that you actually get all the updates and security patches for a few more years. Cool, so I'll go back to the welcome screen and then click on this Install MX Linux. There's actually an installer launcher on the desktop too, and it's the same thing. So I'll click that. And I'll close out of the welcome screen. And so this is the installer. So I'll move this to the left and expand it a bit. So if I were to try to find the corner, oh, there it is. Oh, I got it. But it's actually quite difficult finding the corner because you're looking for a 1 pixel by 1 pixel point, which is the corner. So the easiest way to actually find the corner is go up to your title bar, right click and select resize, and that will throw the cursor to the corner instantly, so you can just drag it from there. Cool, so a quick tour of this MX Linux installer. We have the help instructions to the left, and there's also a live log. So this is kind of like a terminal emulator, so you can see what's going on in the background, but I'll leave it on the help tab. And let's begin. So the first thing to do is to make sure that you're using the right keyboard settings. So the keyboard on this laptop that I'm using is actually the US default keyboard layout, which is PC 105. But if that wasn't the case, it's really easy to change your keyboard settings. Just click on the keyboard settings button, and if your computer is in this list here, you can just select it from here. Or if you actually have a specific language, you can select it by clicking this plus button and then select your language from here. So I'm going to leave it on US English for my keyboard. So I'll just cancel out of there, and then we're back into the installer. So I'll click next, and I'm going to customize the disk layout because I'm going to create partitions that will allow me to use MX Linux on this external hard drive. So I'll click next. And so before I use this screen here, I'll actually do some partitioning. So I'll click on this launcher for gparted. So gparted is a Linux partitioning application. So I'll expand this window as well. And here we are in gparted. So these partitions here are all my Windows partitions. So I'm going to leave this drive alone. And then from this drop down menu, I'll just select my external hard drive. So there it is there. And what I'm going to do is actually delete these partitions that are already on it. So I'll select delete. And then as you can see, there's actually another partition here. So I'll delete that as well. So I'm just right clicking to get the menu. And now let's do some partitioning. So the first partition I'm going to create will actually be for my Grub menu. So what a Grub menu is the MX Linux bootloader, which will allow you to actually choose whether you boot into MX Linux or into Windows. So for this bootloader, I'm going to create one that's 100 megabytes in size. So I'll click tab on my keyboard, and there it is there. So then for the file system, I'll just open that and then choose FAT32. And then for the label, I'll call this MX EFI, and then click add, and there we go, there's our first partition. Now I'm going to create two more partitions. The first partition, which is what we're about to create now, will be for my system files and also my documents and pictures and music and all that. And the third partition I'm going to create is actually going to be my swap partition. Now what a swap partition is kind of like an extension of your RAM. So what this means is that if you were limited with RAM in your machine and you were working on a program and you used up all of your RAM, then you could actually freeze the program, which means that you won't be able to save your work up until that point. And it also has the potential to actually freeze your computer, so you'd actually have to reboot your computer as well. But by creating a swap partition, basically what this means is that when you run out of RAM, MX Linux will actually place the extra data that can't fit onto your RAM into your swap partition, which basically means you've extended your RAM. So if you didn't have much RAM, then it is a good idea to create a swap partition. But if you actually had plenty of RAM in the computer that you're using the hard drive with, then you probably don't need to create a swap partition. But that said, the laptop that I'm using here only has 6 GB of RAM, so I'm going to create a swap partition just to give me a bit of leeway with my RAM usage. Cool, so I'll firstly right click this unallocated space and then select new. And so the general rule of thumb when you're creating a swap partition is that you create a swap partition about equal to this amount of RAM that you have in your computer. So because I have 6 GB of RAM in my computer, I'm going to create a swap partition that is also 6 GB in size. So as you can see here, these amounts are in megabytes. So firstly I have to work out how much 6 GB is in megabytes. So I'll go down to my apps menu and then do a search for calculator. There we go, so calculator is the pre-installed calculator, so I'll open that. And then I'll just work out 6 times 1024, because 1024 megabytes equals 1 GB of RAM. Then click equals, and so 6144 megabytes equals 6 GB of RAM. So I'll just move this calculator to the right a bit so I can still see the figure. And then in the free space following, I'm actually going to put in 6144 for my 6 GB. And so what I'm actually doing is creating this partition for my system files and documents. And then following that will be a 6 GB space here at the end. So if I click tab now, there we go. It's left 6 GB at the end of this partition. So because this partition is the partition we're going to be using for the operating system and documents, I'm going to go here to the file system and I'm going to change this from ext4, which is actually a really stable and fast file system to use. But I'm going to change this to BTRFS. So BTRFS, otherwise known as ButterFS, is a slightly newer file system. And the reason why I did that is because I actually plan to use a program called Timeshift. And Timeshift will actually allow me to create system snapshots, which is sort of the Linux equivalent to a system restore point. Now, by using ButterFS, when I create a snapshot, it's almost instantaneous. Whereas if I were to use ext4, then the snapshots take a lot longer to create. Cool, so for this label, I'm going to call this MX21 and then click add. And then I'll select this unallocated 6 GB space at the end. Right click that, select new. And then in the file system, I'll change this to Linux swap, and then for the label I'll call this MX swap. Cool, so I'll click add, and so here are our new partitions that we've created. So I'll click this button here, the tick button, to apply the operations, and then click apply again. Fantastic, that's completed. So I'll click close now, and gparted will now do a reread. And here are our new partitions that we've just created. So I'll close out of gparted now. And now the MX Linux installer will actually do a scan of the hard drives to see if there are changes that have been made, which it has. And I can now close the calculator, or calculator as it's called. And here are the partitions that we've just created. So for this first partition, the UEFI partition, from this drop-down menu, I'm going to select ESP. So on this partition, I'll actually create a bootloader in the next step that will allow me to boot either into Windows or into MX Linux. And then for the swap file, from this drop-down menu, I'll select swap. And then for this partition, I'm actually going to create 2 subvolumes. So the first subvolume will actually be for my system files, and the second subvolume will actually be for my documents and pictures and music and all that kind of thing. So from this drop-down menu, I'll select format, and then in this format column, I'll just select from the drop down menu BTRFS or BTRFS, and then I'll go over to the left of the format and then right click that, and I'm going to create 2 new subvolumes. There we go, and now I'm going to allocate usage for these subvolumes. So the first subvolume from this drop down menu, I'll select root, and then for the second subvolume I'll select home. So in the label it's automatically placed ampersand or @ symbol for my system files, and then @ home for all my documents and music and pictures and all that kind of thing. So having these 2 labels here are very compatible with Timeshift, which is taking the system snapshots, because Timeshift will recognize that these are my system files and these are my personal files. Of course, what I'm going to do is, just to make sure, is that I'm going to select the blank space for anything else that's showing up in this column here. So I'll also select blank and then select blank. Actually, this is the MX EFI bootloader, so I'll select ESP again. And so these are the correct settings. So now I can click next and I can check the details if I want to. So I'll move this down here, and so it's going to reuse the EFI system partition at SD1, so that's that one there. It's going to format SDD2, which is this one here. It's going to format that for my root and my home subvolume. And then it's not going to format the SDD3 volume because that will be my swap partition. So I'll click yes to that. And I've received a warning that the hard drive that I'm using is not the greatest in the world and it may fail in the future, but that's okay. I'm not actually going to use this other than to just kind of practice with MX Linux. So I'll just click yes to continue. And so this has actually picked up the Windows ESP partition. So I actually don't want to put it there. I want to select the SDD1, which is the partition that I created. So I'll select that. And so this is going to create the bootloader on the external hard drive, and it's going to leave the Windows bootloader alone. So I'll leave this on ESP and then select next. And then in these fields, I'll select a name. And so this is actually the name that my computer will appear on a network as. So I'm going to change this to MX21 EXT1 or external 1 in case I'm going to install this on multiple external hard drives. I'll leave the computer domain name as is and also the work group. And I'm going to actually turn off Samba server because I don't plan on doing Microsoft networking with this hard drive. But if you were planning on doing that, then you'd leave that selected. Then I'll click next. And so here I'll actually choose my locales. So AU for Australia, and then Australia. I'm going to leave it on 12-hour time, and then for the service settings, if I click view, you can actually turn any of these on or off, but it's generally a good idea to keep them all enabled. So I'll just click OK, and then next, and then I'm going to enter my username and password. And if I wanted to actually create a separate administrator password, then I could do that here, but if I deselect that, then it's going to use the same password that I used to log in also for my administrator password as well. I'm going to leave auto login turned off, but save live desktop changes I'm going to actually enable, because this means that Simple Screen Recorder that I've downloaded and installed will actually be included as part of this operating system. So I don't actually have to reinstall Simple Screen Recorder by enabling this option here. So now I'll click next, and then I'll just turn on the live log so we can see what's going on in the background. And so what I'm going to do is speed up the rest of this video while the install completes, and then rejoin you once the installation has completed. Cool, that's now completed, so I can now reboot the computer. So if I just click finish here, that will actually reboot the computer because I have this ticked, but I actually have to turn off Simple Screen Recorder, and then I'll do a reboot. And there we go, we've now installed MX Linux onto an external hard drive. Now if you want to actually run MX Linux from that external hard drive on different computers, then you just have to make sure that you jump into your BIOS settings or your UEFI settings and change your boot order so that your external hard drive will boot before the hard drive that Windows is sitting on. So that's all there is to it. In the next episode, we're actually going to do a deep dive into MX Linux itself and start customizing it. Cool, so if you'd like to help the channel out, then please like the video or leave us a comment. All of that definitely helps the channel out immensely. At some point, hopefully I'll be able to do this full time, but we can only dream, huh? I've also put a link to my Patreon in the description, so if you'd like to help out in any way, then that would be immensely appreciated, and I'll even put your name in the closing credits of each video. So thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.